Hello, my creatures of the night, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of Throwback Tuesdays. Rather than doing a countdown, I'm going to simply talk about the 1970s from a music perspective, mainly in the growth of metal and various types of rock. Now, let me start off by saying the 1970s were quite the transitional time in the music world. Things began to shift and change. You had so many subgenres emerging that touched on topics you'd never even imagine. Now let's start with metal, obviously, my genre. We started with Black Sabbath. Now these guys obviously weren't the first guys to have that heavy metal sound. If you go back to the '60s, you had Blue Cheer and Vanilla Fudge, but these guys were one of the first official metal bands, or they were the first band to be labeled as a metal band. And these guys were one of the first to take their music into the occult, the darkness, and evil. When this music first hit the waves, it brought fear to the children's ears and put distress on everyone else. This music took you down a path that your parents had always shielded you from, especially coming from the '60s when everything was about peace and love and flower power. This was quite the opposite, but it was indeed the gateway for all the metal out there in this day and age. Black Sabbath was the seed, and then you had influences from that, which sprouted into influences, influenced after influence after influence, basically, and it basically influenced everything. All the metal that exists now is because of Black Sabbath. Because Black Sabbath influenced the second wave and the third wave and the fourth wave. It's basically it's like it's like a periodic table, I guess you can say. But you also had another band that rode the line of classic rock and heavy metal, and they rode that line with persistence and perfection. Many people aren't able to determine whether they are full-on classic rock or full-on heavy metal, because they have a bit of everything in them, and that band was Led Zeppelin. These guys actually came from a '60s band entitled the Yardbirds and took things down a completely different road. They had that hard and heavy sound with the incorporation of blues in the mix. Led Zeppelin is one of my personal favorite bands of all time, so I'm truly grateful for the '70s and the Yardbirds for giving us this fantastic group. Another band quite similar to Led Zeppelin when it comes to riding that line of classic rock and heavy metal is Deep Purple. These guys started out psychedelic, but really wanted to shift things into a new sound in the 1970s and do what they felt they were most comfortable doing. And they created some of the most iconic guitar riffs of all time, and they influenced so many future bands ahead of them, at least metal bands, even some rock bands. With the incorporation of the keyboard and organ, that showed that rock and roll isn't just guitar and drums. And these guys, they are another one of my favorites. I'd like to think these guys were the three bands that really influenced, they were huge influences on what became heavy metal in the early 1970s. But another band that truly brought out the full-on heavy metal was Judas Priest. These guys started out in the '70s and were one of the first of the new wave of British heavy metal and are truly iconic. And they had that pure against the grain old school heavy metal sound. They weren't really considered anything else. They were full on heavy metal. Now, while heavy metal was planting its roots in the early '70s, rock was also sprouting into various subgenres. You had hard rock like AC/DC, Steppenwolf, and Bachman Turner Overdrive, soft rock like James Taylor and Chilliwack, arena rock like Queen and Foghat. You had southern rock like Lynyrd Skynyrd and ZZ Top. You had punk, but punk is not, I wouldn't associate punk with rock. Punk is its own separate movement, with the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and the Damned, Black Flag. That's its own movement, and that definitely started in the '70s as well, and influenced a lot after that. But you also have one of my favorite subgenres of rock, progressive rock, better known as prog rock. And one of the most talked about prog rock bands would have to be Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd also started out in the psychedelic field with their early works such as Saucerful of Secrets. But over time, they shifted more towards the progressive rock concept album theme, which is basically telling a story or focusing on a specific theme with an entire album, which is absolutely amazing. They did have psychedelic influences in the mix of progressive rock, which is fantastic. Another band that really shined in doing so was King Crimson. These guys were progressive rock at their craziest. And then you had the incredible technicality of bands like Yes, with their keyboardist Rick Wakeman on 6 to 8 keyboards. Another great band. Even Rush was super progressive and technical starting out, to the point where rock started getting kind of nerdy and taken way too seriously, which, I mean, it was cool as well. All in all, the 70s saw the rise of so much good music. I mean, you saw some stuff from the 50s and 60s kind of fading away. Saw stuff live its time, but you saw the emergence of so many different types of rock. You saw the birth of heavy metal, and you saw disco, which we're not going to talk about. We even heard the earliest hip hop in the late 70s, which disco gave us. Motown and soul were still going. And the 70s were a great time for music. It was a great time for culture as well, well, until disco took over. We're not going to get into disco. That was just ridiculous. But yeah, all in all, it was the 70s were a fun time to be a music fan. I truly wish I got to experience that, but I listen to the music. I listen to the music and I enjoy it. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's Throwback Tuesday. And thank you guys for watching, and rock on.